Last week we learned about plot. We drew a plot diagram so we could see kind of how authors create a story. Well, for any story to be created, there has to be a conflict. So today we're going to learn about the types of conflict. Conflict can be divided into two different categories. You have your internal conflict and then your external conflict. Internal conflict is the kind of conflict that occurs in our own heads. Notice that internal begins with the prefix in. This should help you to remember that it occurs inside. An external conflict occurs outside. One of the meanings of the prefix ex is outside. Like in the hallways, you see a sign that says exit. What does that tell you? It tells you that's how you get outside. So ex, remember the prefix, means out, in means inside. So in your spirals, let's write down these two types of conflict. Now let's look at some examples. If you think it's an internal conflict, inside conflict, put one finger up. If you think it's an external conflict, outside conflict, put two fingers up. Keep your hands right in front of you so that no one else can see what you think. And make sure to keep them up until I can get a good scan of the room. Here's your first situation. There's a student named Lakira and she kicks Edwin. Is that internal or external? If you said external, you are right. Here's another one. Edwin shouts angrily at Lakira. Is that internal or external? Good. Maya cannot decide which eligible young man she wants to date. Is that an internal problem or external? Good. Miss Smith and Mr. White get into a shouting match about which is better, reading or writing. If you said two, you're right. That's external. Everton has mixed emotions towards his girlfriend. He doesn't know whether to continue his relationship or to break up with her. That's an internal conflict. Sienna gets stuck in a thunderstorm without an umbrella. Even though there's no character, that's a external conflict. All of the kids at Jasmine's old school snub her because they think she's too smart. Is that inside or outside conflict? External. Shanika is offered a partial ride to the boarding school in Japan and a full ride to the boarding school in Pennsylvania. So she has two offers from two different schools. She doesn't know which opportunity she should choose. Internal. On a visit to New England boarding school, a group of Philadelphia Academy students get stuck in an ice storm and have to reschedule one of their visits. Now let's break it down. There are really three different kinds of external conflicts that you'll notice when you read. The most common one is human versus human. Whenever two people disagree about something and they're pitted against each other, we call that human versus human. Our journal today was about conflicts you might see at school. That's human versus human. So when Andy Evans assaults Melinda in a story, that's a clear example of human versus human. There's nothing physical about all human versus human conflicts, but sometimes, for example, it can be a bully. It could be a bully that's saying mean things to another student. That's a conflict, but it's not necessarily physical. So in our notes, let's jot down human versus human as the first possible kind of conflict. The second common kind of conflict is human versus society. Last week we wrote about Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and how he was a hero because he ensured the freedom of other members of society. When something was unfair, he spoke up. That's a good example of a human versus society. Whenever you have one character up against a group of characters, or even up against a system, a big system like the United States government that belongs to a group of characters, you're looking at human versus society. The book To Kill a Mockingbird is a great example of a human versus society. Let's jot this one down. One more to go. Stop. Stop. The next one would be human versus nature. If you've ever read a survival story, like Hatchet, for example, you're probably reading a story about a human versus nature conflict. In Hatchet, Brian's plane crashes in the middle of nowhere, and he needs to battle the wind and the rain and the cold to survive. That's human versus nature. Let's add that too. Lucky for us, there's only one type of internal conflict, and that is a human versus his own mind, or human versus self. So if you're having difficulty making a decision, or if you feel guilty about something you've done, if you have mixed feelings or confusion, you're reading about how a character is struggling within themselves. So we call these internal conflicts, or human versus self. In the movie Twilight, or the book Twilight, Bella is torn between being a good daughter to her mother and father and spending an increasing amount of time with her boyfriend Edward. So that's a good example. Let's jot down human versus self.